Hi, everyone. Thank you for sharing your Thursday morning with us. My name is Olga Kiriliuk, and I'm chair of SEEDIG Executive Committee. And it is my huge privilege and pleasure to welcome you here today at the SEEDIG 7 Series Town Hall Regulating AI, Which Approach to Follow. We booked the next 2 hours in your busy calendars to altogether find an answer to this tricky question. And I can say from the number of registrations that we received that this topic proved to be of huge interest, not only to our community, but far beyond. And what is even more interesting that we received almost equal interest from the representatives of all stakeholder groups, which is, to be honest, not so often to happen. So we are all very happy to have you here today, and I'm sure that our today's conversation, and I want to stress it that we want it to be exactly the conversation between all of you and our speakers, will be full of practical insights, because we are so lucky today to have with us incredibly knowledgeable speakers and experts from the Council of Europe, UNESCO, OECD, Europools, who have the first-hand experience working on finding what would be the right approach to regulating artificial intelligence. And you will hear much more about the speakers and from the speakers just in a while. But I want to take this moment to introduce the people who will be guiding us through today's conversation. And please join me in welcoming our moderators, Christian Bartolin, Secretary to the Council of Europe Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and Irina Buzu, AI and Fairness Co-Lead at the Institute for Internet and Just Society. I also want to remind you that we have a live stream on Facebook and YouTube, and we also have a remote moderator, Valeria Codreanu, who will be taking care of your questions and comments, which you leave here in the Zoom chat, but also on the live streaming platforms, and we'll bring them to the attention of our event moderators. Please do not hesitate to ask your questions and to make comments. This is supposed to be a live conversation, a very flexible conversation, and we would be very happy to hear from all of you. And structurally, we will start from 20 minutes keynote chat, which will be followed by around 90 minutes discussion between you and our guest speakers. And I think I'll stop here, because I'm sure that you, same as me, are very excited to hear from our keynote speaker, Gregor Stroyan, Chair of Council of Europe Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, or as we all call it, CAHAI. And Irina, I pass the floor to you here, as you have this huge privilege to chat with Gregor this morning.
Hi, Olga. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. Basically, for a second year in a row, when co-moderating the session on artificial intelligence at SEEDIG, I'm absolutely delighted and thankful to the SEEDIG team for offering me this opportunity to do this for a second year in a row, and incredibly honored to be able to hold a virtual discussion with Gregor Stroyan. And without further ado, I suggest we proceed to the session per se. So, as AI regulation is one of basically the hottest topics on the regulatory agenda, and the call for a common European regulation has been out there for quite some time. And from a European perspective, it could be argued that the Council of Europe and CAHAI in particular are pioneers in tackling this legal innovation challenge. Why would you say there is so much attention currently given to AI regulation? And what were the main key points you had to consider and address when designing the regulatory framework?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Irina, for the introductory question, and also thank you, Olga, for the introduction in general. Before I start, I would just like to say hi to all the participants. I'm delighted to be here, and it is actually my privilege to speak to you. I see we have quite a lot of participants, and I'm addressing you from, I guess, the northwest corner of the Southeast European region, from Ljubljana, Slovenia. And indeed, I have the honor of serving as the chair of CAHAI, the Ad Hoc Committee on Artificial Intelligence, which was established 2 years ago by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, with the task of examining the feasibility of a potential legal instrument and defining the elements of such an instrument related to design, development, and application of AI according to the standards on human rights, democracy, and rule of law as established by the Council of Europe. We can see that artificial intelligence is a pervasive technology which is taking over all pores of human life, and not only human life, also of the industry that is somewhere behind the scenes. It is a culmination of the development of computers, the large quantity of data that is being gathered and processed by sensors and these computers, and of the statistical and algorithmic models which have been developed not only in the previous years, but also in the last half a century and are now being applied to these data with the help of the compute. And we have been, in a way, primed or conditioned to think of artificial intelligence in sci-fi terms. Most of the population knows artificial intelligence from movies and books, beginning with Frankenstein and later on Matrix and Terminator and so on. But we are actually using AI on a daily basis when we use, for example, road navigation, and when we get information about delays and what optional routes to take. It's being used in video processing. It's being used in automated industrial production. It's used in logistics, as said. It's used in medicine. It's used in many fields of life. But it is also increasingly being used by in ways that can influence and impact human rights. It can impact our own lives on individual level and societal level. And this is where the work of international organizations, especially of the Council of Europe, comes into the foreground. We are putting an emphasis on how AI is impacting our own position in the society, our individual position in the society, our right to dignity, our right to freedom of expression, our right to assembly, also freedom or right to life. And on a societal level, how this is impacting those crucial social structures which define our society, especially the democracy and the rule of law, how we behave toward each other. And the main fears at this point are not that the robots would take over. The main fears are not that artificial intelligence would take over the world and dictate how we are supposed to live our lives or even enslave us, as many people have grown to think through the movies in the past decades. The main fear is how humans use the AI, how humans use the new technology. Our main fear is not the technology itself, but how this technology is put in use by humans. And the work of CAHAI and also other international organizations, it's not about regulating the technology, but regulating the framework in which humans, organizations, governments, and businesses operate and use AI so that it is in service of humanity or in the service which is compliant with the standards of human rights, rule of law, and democracy.
Well, building a bit on what you've said, because I do absolutely agree with the fact that artificial intelligence is impacting mainly all the areas of our life today. And because of that, in the past few years, we've witnessed quite a few attempts at designing ethical and legal frameworks for emerging technologies. Some would come from international organizations, some would come from local government, civil society, academia, tech companies, each trying to address the topic in ways that would solve the issues faced by that particular stakeholder. building on the fact that the need for regulation comes about when there is either a legislation gap, or there is a legislation vacuum, or there are pre-existing fragmented or conflicting legal norms. Could it be said that there was a general expectation for a comprehensive European legally binding instrument on artificial intelligence that would also be able to balance, regulation with innovation?
It's hard to distinguish the motives on why certain initiatives were formed. It is well understood that the risks of AI have started emerging in the last decade, or the understanding of the risks of AI started emerging in the last decade. And this created sort of a race toward finding the solutions to these risks. And it started primarily with private initiatives, non-binding initiatives, and that is normal. Even if you allow me a parallel tangential look at the history of regulation, for example, of automobile industry or the cars. When cars were introduced in the beginning of the 20th century, there was no regulation as to the automobile industry or traffic regulations and so on. Traffic regulations, basically, they were based on the horse and carriage rules. People lived on the streets. They worked on the streets, they sold stuff on the streets, children played on the streets, and cars came and they started running over people. And there were some recommendations on how this should be regulated, but it wasn't until the 1920s when the first traffic rules were introduced. Only later on, a more comprehensive set of traffic rules also encompassed other participants in the traffic, meaning the pedestrians, for example. Jaywalking was formed as a misdemeanor. And it wasn't the cars that were regulated for that. Others had to adapt that. And at the same time, or not at the same time, but subsequently, security equipment of the cars was introduced. The seat belt, only in about 1960s or 1970s, became obligatory. But now it is indispensable. Even registration of cars so that they can be identified. We can see some parallels with what the people are trying to do with artificial intelligence systems. Not to be not mentioned is also the exhausts of the vehicles. How much is permissible? Something that is impacting the climate change in the long run. It's something that was mentioned already by the developers in the beginning of the 20th century, where there was already a debate whether to stick to electric cars, which were used in the beginning, or move to the gasoline and diesel cars. And eventually, the producers chose gas cars because of their efficiency and profitability. And we've only seen electric cars being introduced now back 100 years later. But the debate about the exhausts and their impact on the environment was present already in the beginning of the 1900s. So with this tangential mention, I would say that many concerns about AI have started emerging and are relevant, pertinent, already now about both what I was mentioning before, how humans use AI, and how AI is going to impact various parts of our life. And most of the initiatives were based on the concerns of the stakeholders that formed them. And they were partial, they were not comprehensive, and what is most important is they were not, and they are not, binding. They are not enforceable. They're at the level of recommendations, and they are something that was used in the process of Kahai when we were designing the framework for our work. Basically, we looked at all the initiatives of international organizations and also non-binding recommendations of other organizations. And we've managed to get an overview of what is the general concern, what are the general principles that are being addressed, and what are the general and specific methods that are recommended for addressing these challenges. And we took the understanding and knowledge of all these initiatives and made a gist of it that was compliant with the consensus that we managed to get from the member states of Council of Europe on what is really crucial at this stage and what is also the priority at this stage. Are we going to address a problem that's going to come up in 20 or 30 years, for example, general artificial intelligence, or are we going to address the framework in which the governments are operating right now and which is already impacting the human rights of individuals? For example, are we going to propose or promote registers of AI systems that are being used by national systems? Are we going to demand transparency of the AI operators on what systems they are using, how they're using them, and also how these systems operate? Are we going to recommend or actually even prohibit or suggest prohibiting not using or prohibiting obscure algorithms for areas which significantly impact human rights, for example, law enforcement, justice, social rights, etc. We are looking now how to combine the new technology with the existing techniques and the social technology or the social fabric that is guiding our lives, so that we can slowly incorporate this without major risks to our human position. I hope this answers your question on how we came from the initial initiatives to now. Maybe I can, during your question, I will post in the chat a site, a website, which is on the KAHAI website, and which shows the development of AI initiatives throughout the past decade. We will be able to see that up until 2017, there were only a couple of 10 initiatives that were developed, and then this started mushrooming. And now we have almost 500 initiatives. And only KAHAI and European Commission are at this point promoting or proposing something that has a binding, enforceable nature. And this is what is crucial in the long run if we want to keep in check various developments that are disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Gregor. You've answered my question, but it also brought up a lot of new questions from me. Because as a lawyer, I'm always thinking about a regulation as an instrument that offers legal certainty to users, in this case, to the people and their rights and freedoms. And in terms of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, it is an incredible challenge to develop a framework that is going to be relevant today, but also tomorrow, and also perhaps in 2 months or half a year, 2 years. But considering the fact that artificial intelligence is developing so fast, I am assuming that this is incredibly difficult to kind of foresee how to frame a regulation that is going to be relevant and up to date in the near future, or like the midterm future. So coming from this, what were the let's say main 3 key points or like key challenges that you had to think of when designing the regulation?
Well, one disclaimer or one caveat. At this point, we are framing or elaborating the elements for a potential legal instrument. And formally, it will be up to the Committee of Ministers to decide then what to do with that. But we expect that they will propose that this goes into the next phase of negotiations for a framework convention. And yes, you're completely right. We need to have an instrument or a set of instruments which form a legal framework or a framework, which are technology neutral to the extent that they allow it to survive over a certain period of time, but at the same time are definite enough so that they can be legally binding and enforceable, so that we have definitions and classifications which clearly stipulate what kind of systems, on what kind of what types of uses, what conditions are applicable to the addressees, and what addressees are obligated to follow them. And first thing that we had to do was to look at what is the scope of the problem. What are we addressing within the CAHI or within the Council of Europe? And we've identified a set of procedural and substantive gaps. What we have discovered is that it is true that many of the issues that are being posed by the AI, and we have evidence for them, can be addressed through the existing legal norms, but the instruments that serve this are fragmented, they're burdensome to individuals, hard to enforce, and of course there are gaps because in some countries it would be impossible to enforce them in the same way as, for example, in Netherlands or the United States or United Kingdom. But the technology is global, and it needs also a global or at least wider regional approach. So first thing, we identified what are the key procedural and substantive elements. Second, we have discovered or came to a consensus that one instrument is not enough and it would not be appropriate. And we need a set of instruments, at least one binding of horizontal nature that would be applicable to all the systems. And this is also what I was referring mainly in the beginning, but we will also need a set of sectoral instruments that will address vertically individual sectors of human activity. And this is something that's already happening in various fields, from social welfare, elections, justice. We know that, for example, CEPES, of which I'm a member of, published the first set of ethical guidelines for the use of artificial intelligence already in 2018. And all these different sectors will both develop and adapt over time the rules that will be quite specific to individual types of uses. I can already foresee that a lot will be done in the field of medicine. So the second thing, as I said, we have came to a consensus that we need a framework that consists of horizontal and vertical instruments. And some of them need to be binding, some of them can remain at the level of recommendations. And eventually, as we can see with the car industry that I mentioned before, the market will sort it out eventually. And the third thing, if we want to be effective, coherent and comprehensive, we need to look at the work of other initiatives and other organizations as complementary, not competitive. And we need to look at the work of all the organizations according to their mandate, competence, and the potential for enforcement regarding considering their scope of the mandate. So we need to focus on the area where each organization is the strongest and where it has experience. And wherever possible, we need to reuse or combine the use of some elements that are common. And this is why I encourage all the organizations to find common elements in each other. For example, I encourage that we focus on the definition, classification, and terminology that is being developed by the OECD, even if some countries are not members of it. That we encourage other organizations that they look at the Council of Europe's work in terms of the human rights impact assessment methodology that is being developed. And eventually, through that, we will be able to form a comprehensive global legal framework, or at least potentially globally applicable, even if individual countries do not accede to it.
It's absolutely great to actually see that we're trying to move from a competition-based perspective towards a collaboration kind of based perspective on artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. And it was truly exciting to see the launch of the most recent kind of global cooperation on artificial intelligence. And we hope, at least as lawyers who are interested in regulating emerging technologies, we hope to see much more. As you said, we expect a global cohesion on the understanding of all the key points relating to artificial intelligence, although we cannot expect them to be absolutely universally accepted by all the countries. But it's great to have here today, at the very least, 3 of the organizations who are part of the Global Observatory on Artificial Intelligence. Gregor, thank you so much for all your answers. It's going to bring about a new debate, and probably in a different setting that has much more time for discovering all the questions that I personally have, and I'm sure our listeners also have. But because we're also strained by the time framework of this session, I suppose we can proceed to the next one. But before I give the floor to my fellow co-moderator, Christian, I would like to just quickly mention that thankful to our wonderful SEEDIG team, they have prepared 2 poll questions for our audience here. They will be mentioned in the chat. Those 2 questions are you worried about the use of artificial intelligence? And here you can either choose, no, it brings more opportunities and threats, or yes, it brings more threats and opportunities, or I don't know, I'm here to find an answer. And the second question, the use of AI should be regulated on national level, international, shouldn't be regulated, or yet again, I don't know, I'm here to find the answer. So please don't be shy, try to engage as much as possible in the poll. It will be open for quite some time until the end of the session. And without further ado, Christian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irina. And let me also start by thanking the SEEDIG team for inviting me and the Council of Europe to co-moderate this important SEEDIG 7 series town hall. I have with me today 3 very distinguished panelists, and I hope that I will be able to dig a little bit into their brains and find out some of the questions that we are all addressing or trying to address, including in the poll. First of all, I have, and I'm mentioning them here in the order that they appear that we will take the interview, is Mr. Pratik Sibal, who is a program specialist at the Digital Innovation Transformation section of the Communications and Information sector at UNESCO, so the United Nations. And Mrs. Laura Galinda Romero, who is an AI policy analyst at OECD and working at the Artificial Intelligence Policy Observatory. And then finally, Mrs. Cesara Panait, I hope it's rightly said, Panait, sorry if I got it wrong, head of digital policy at Europulse, and who's also really very, very busy and influential research and policy activist. We will start with some questions. I have, with the agreement of SEEDIG, proposed 5 questions that I will ask to each of our panelists in turn, because I think it's important that we have the chance to get different views on the same topics. And I will start with you, Mr. Sibel. Are you there?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Christian, for the introduction and having me here.
Thank you very much, Pratik. Thank you very much, Pratik, and welcome to the town hall. My first question for you is, should AI be regulated more than it is today? And here we are thinking not just of, domestic legislation, but also international legislation. Are there some risks to regulating or to not regulating? Are there some loopholes in the existing framework, or does it actually suffice for our purposes?
Yeah,
Pratik,
for sure. Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you to SEEDIG for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. And thanks to all the participants who've joined us today for your time. I will try to kind of reframe the discussion a little bit just on the question of regulation itself. How I understand it is more broadly a way to influence human behavior along particular objectives. So this can be a legal approach, but there can be other ways through standards and norms, or nowadays we also talk about nudging. So regulation is broader than just the legal framework, because we need to think about more tools than the legal framework provides us as well, while we think of this broader question. The second preface that I would put is around just technology and regulation itself. There is a dilemma which David Collingridge put forward many years ago about technology regulation, which is also called the Collingridge dilemma, which says that when a new technology emerges, we do not really know about its impact on society, what are the risks associated with it, and hence we are a bit under ignorance on how to deal with it. So in the initial stages, we don't have enough information. However, when we move further down, the impacts start to become clearer. The technology becomes somewhat more deeply entrenched in society, and it becomes a bit hard to regulate. So this is a bit characteristic of also the debates that we are seeing around AI. And Gregor mentioned in his initial remarks that a lot of the risks started to emerge over the past 10 years, much before when we were talking about social media and filter bubbles. This language of filter bubbles, echo chambers, content personalization started to emerge much later. And then we started to kind of see the repercussions on democracy, perhaps the most strongly starting 2016 and so on, when we have polarized online communities, people just looking at their own social media feeds based on how the algorithms are showing them content. So the whole debate around technology can be understood as a dilemma itself. But what are the guardrails when we go ahead? So in Collingridge's proposal, he talks about first regulating in a way that the cost of putting a remedy later is low. You are continuously monitoring the challenges emerging so that you can put fixes. So there's a bunch of these ways which can inform regulatory thinking. Just if we zoom out and look at AI as a socio-technical interaction and not just an artifact to be regulated like we would do probably in consumer protection and products. We zoom out and talk about it as a broader socio-technical system. So this is kind of the lens that I personally like to bring when I'm thinking about technology regulation, and then downstream work on developing whatever instruments. Now, coming to the specific question from Christian, do we have enough regulation or not? I don't know. I am sure there are, for instance, there are gaps which studies have shown. The lens that I would take here is fundamental freedoms, rule of law, and democracy. What are the gaps are we seeing there? And based on those gaps, we develop regulation, which can be both horizontal and vertical, uh, based on sector specific needs. So I will just stop here, and maybe over to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Pratik. I think this was really an interesting reply, and I believe that you're very right about that. There are different approaches to it, and we have to consider all the benefits and the less benefits involved in addressing AI issues through regulation. But do you think that there are some aspects of AI and its use which are more important to regulate than others? And in that case, why? You were already mentioning some areas, but please let me hear what you're thinking.
For sure. So it really depends on the framework that one brings to the discussion when you talk about what is important to me, and generally also to UNESCO and mostly the international community here. Fundamental rights, freedoms, human rights are super important, and kind of not an area where we see trade-offs and making compromises and balancing. They have a higher moral status than just comparing innovation versus human rights. I personally don't see that we should be trading off, because this has a higher moral status. So for sure, technology applications of AI where we are seeing adverse impact on human rights would be a priority area. There is already a lot of international discussion around it. Recently, the UNHCR came up with a report which asked for a moratorium on some of these. There's a lot of reports coming from, of course, the Council of Europe, from UNESCO. The ethical recommendation is providing some guardrails on these issues. So for me, diving down perhaps to some specific examples would be in terms of facial recognition in the public sphere. Live detection, it is not only about privacy, also coming from different regional perspectives. And if you talk to people, for instance, just generally people say, oh, I have nothing to hide, so privacy doesn't matter. But that's not right. It's when you are in the public space, we also need to think beyond privacy and data protection, but also about the chilling effect it has on freedom of expression. That is super important. So when we talk about emotional recognition, technologies like I mean, it's just mind-boggling. If we allow these systems, we are left with no democratic freedoms. So we really need to focus on these issues at the very get-go. And some of the approaches that are emerging are risk proportionate approaches to technology, AI governance. We need to think a little bit more as to how we frame this discussion. I think it's a great conversation starter. I've been also reading, for instance, the most advanced being the EU legislation, and which takes this approach, but also now the response from the civil society on this. It's quite encouraging to go through that and see how the debate is framed around fundamental rights not being something that we want to compromise on, are not tradable. We need to ring fence them, draw red lines, be respect rule of law, democracy, strengthen systems there. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I think these are very, very wise words, Pratik. I am personally also quite concerned about the chilling effect that AI or some AI applications may actually have on democracy and democratic rights. We talk a lot about the human rights that are involved, and these are, of course, the privacy issues and also others, certainly. But the effects that AI may have on the way we behave in social gatherings and how we interact with each other in public places, I think that's something to really be considered very carefully as well. The problem is obviously that we do not have the same set of clearly defined standards when it comes to democracy as we have when it comes to human rights or rule of law. So I think there we have an important task in front of us, all of us. So thanks for pointing this out. I would like to ask you now, in your view, let's suppose we'll have some AI regulation. What would be the most important elements if you had to choose 3 to put in that AI regulation?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky, hard question here to choose just three. And I remember this also comes from the Kahai consultation, which was done with the international organizations. And there we wrote, oh, first we need a framework to prioritize because we really you can talk about education, and then in education in schools where people are using technologies to basically assess the mental activity of students. That's super scary to me. uh, where is the room for the child to just be and just be a human? And so we can't be in this constant state of surveillance and being judged. There is just no room for child development in that sense. But also, as I mentioned, in the open spaces, the use of facial recognition technologies, emotional recognition systems, I think should primarily first be dealt with quite strongly. There is a strong commercial interest, there's geopolitics involved, but the fight for strengthening human rights is never over. And sometimes we may feel we are it's a settled matter, but I think we have to constantly reinvent and reinvigorate the debate and the language, uh, because and be very conscious on where we are moving when we talk about human rights. So I would say anything that touches human rights, especially also on social media, we are seeing massive amounts of polarization, disinformation spreading, which has huge consequences for democracy, as we've seen around the world. Uh, how do we deal with this? Are there regulatory practices, policy solutions? Are there standards? Do we need to talk about competition law here in terms of limiting the power of certain uh, platforms and so on? I think we need to think a bit more deeply and build those connections, which I think we are all doing through these kind of conversations. But also coming from an organization that has a global mandate, the discussion, I've been actually talking to our field offices across the world and understanding where is the kind of AI related discussion. A lot of it is still focused on awareness raising. Uh, we we in Europe we are thinking. I'm just coming from Paris. Uh, this is kind of broadly, generally in the public sphere or in the engagements we are talking about it. But in a lot of places, policymakers are not talking about it. What are the risks? What are the harms? A lot of the agenda is not driven in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So all those things need to be taken into account for more inclusive, rights-based, open, transparent, multi-stakeholder development of AI. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pratik. I think this is also, again, this is a very important point that you make, and I think that it is. I think that if I may add one thing to the many pertinent elements that you came up with, I would also say to have a critical approach to how we use AI and for what purposes we use it. There are some applications out there that are pretty loony in their own right, such as prediction of crime on the basis of cranial features and other kinds of pseudoscience that we had basically left behind us almost 100 years ago. And now they are coming back now as AI applications. I think with something we have to bear in mind that there's a lot of education and critical thinking to be done also about how we use AI.
Just if I can add something quickly there.
Sure.
I think we also tend to take away sometimes in debates a deterministic view of technology, and just say that, oh, this is happening, this will happen, we just need to adapt. I think we should be very conscious of technology is not neutral. It is laden with scripts on how we develop it. There are biases that comes from not only the data in this case, but also from programmers. So we need to just not be taking a deterministic view. At the same time, not also an instrumentalist view that it's just a tool, because it's really how I see is a mediator. And some great work coming from Professor Peter Paul Verbeek at the University of Twente on this, if someone is interested on technology mediation, is quite interesting. Yeah.
Which, in your view, then would be the main stakeholders in AI regulation? Because you're already mentioning that there are so many different interests involved. But in your view, who are the main stakeholders?
Yeah. So we definitely always promote a multi-stakeholder approach to governance of technologies. I'll just give a small example on what can be the repercussion of not having inclusion. When we were talking about digitalizing languages from the written script to online, there were certain standards which were created. Now, when these standards were created, they basically gave a code for how a language written would be converted to its digital format. In this process, uh, some of the languages that we see today basically lose a part of their structure and grammar when they are translated online because the technology is influencing what can go online. So a part of culture is lost in that sense. A part of people's identity is lost because a technology standard was set up in a way which was perhaps not as inclusive as it should have been. So these kind of things have tangible consequences. In terms of the stakeholders, of course, we need to definitely engage with the civil society, the private sector, the international organizations, academia, but also strengthen their negotiating power. It's not just about being at the table in a conference without having the backing and the support to be able to be present there. A lot of times, if we talk about inclusion and diversity in these conversations, if you are inviting someone from a developing country, are you kind of addressing some of the financial aspects related to their participation, the labor they put in it, the time that is put there? So it's just not about having a checklist and getting people around the table, but also ensuring it's about equality of opportunity, that people are empowered. At UNESCO, we of course work on with indigenous communities as well to bring in their perspectives, with especially now the decade of indigenous languages being adopted by the UNGA starting 2022. So we need to engage with as many diverse communities as possible from different regions, linguistic groups. A lot of times the consultation is in English or one of the 6 UN language, for instance. A lot of people are left out. So how can we make it inclusive? And maybe AI technologies can also play a role in making that process itself inclusive. So yeah.
Yeah, it's true what you're saying, and very much also about the positive role that AI can also play. We have a tendency to focus on the negative aspects, but it's of course important to remember that AI can also be a huge advantage. It has a lot to do, in my view at least, with how we approach the AI and our own sets of behavior with regard to AI and how we see our role and the AI's role. I have another question, one of the last ones for you, but how would you preferably approach AI regulation, and why would you do it so? And here I'm thinking about, would you like it to be, legally binding regulation, non-binding regulation, for instance, ethical standards? Would you like it to be something that is imposed by states or public authorities, or would you like it to be self-regulation from the industry and the users of the AI? What do you think would be the most pertinent?
I think it's all of these, depending on where and what is the application. If we're talking about legally binding, for sure, when we talk about fundamental rights, democracy, human rights, we need legally binding framework. We need mechanisms for redress. We need accountability and transparency in those processes. And without legal teeth, it's just won't take us any far. We've already talked a lot about ethics washing and issues like that. So ethics is super important in defining and the underpinning framework on how we approach and think about problems, but we need to go further. So one aspect is legal, the other aspect is just technical standards that are kind of ethics by design, which also influence how new technologies are developed, how platforms interoperate with each other. these discussions are super important as well. In some cases, they can be self-regulation. We really need to balance in some cases as to what is the flip side also. For instance, when we talk about small and medium enterprises, with too much of a compliance burden may end up really killing those organizations. For instance, some study which was, for instance, on the GDPR, one of the unintended consequences was that it probably led to more concentration in the advertising market. As a result, some of the major online advertisers' share increased, and some of the smaller players were left out because of compliance issues probably. So we need to be a bit more conscious on that side as well, because those economic rights of people are also important for their lives. Yeah.
Thank you, Pratik. One final question for you, and then I will let you have from, and then then I will move on. From a global organization's point of view, you work with UNESCO. What are the biggest challenges for societies currently posed by AI? And here we're talking, in general. You mentioned before, awareness raising. Are there others?
Yeah, for sure. So we at UNESCO work at multiple levels. One is awareness raising, basically organizing regional discussions around these questions. We did in Africa regional forum, in Latin America as well, then a global forum on AI, and so on. But moving beyond awareness raising, there is standard setting work which is happening with the recommendation on ethics of AI coming up for adoption in November 2021, the only truly global standard, which has of course benefited from a lot of engagement with all the organizations who are participating here at the OECD, Council of Europe, and so on. So it's also in conversation, an instrument that is being developed. Going further, we are also working on capacity building, an element which is the AI and the rule of law. How do you ensure, and I think someone mentioned in the chat, I briefly saw, what are the capacities and infrastructure available to actually, once you have these rules, to make sure that they can be implemented. So we are working as part of a broader initiative called the Judges Initiative to develop, we are developing a course on AI and the rule of law, which talks about AI use within justice systems for the administration of justice. And there are a lot of legal issues, human rights issues within that as well, but also how it can be used to improve access to justice and delivery of justice, and the legal implications of AI, same privacy, freedom of expression, and to strengthen capacities globally of judicial operators. So UNESCO has engaged with about 23,000 judicial operators globally since 2013 on freedom of expression, access to information, safety of journalists. And now this year we'll be launching in November the registration for this course, and then later, early next year, the course itself in 7 languages. It's really a global conversation with judges from India to Peru, from Geneva, everyone participating and sharing their perspective as a conversation starter. And then we go and see how can we link these communities to strengthen their capacities, because few years down the line, they are going to be the ones who will be adjudicating on these matters. And we need to make sure that the capacities exist. So that's another activity that we are working on. And I'll just probably stop here then. Yeah.
That's very good, Pratik, because I have one final question for you, and this comes actually from our chat. How do you outline the ethics in AI? And I'm asking you because I know that amongst other things, you're also working on ethical standards in the UNESCO framework.
Yes. So the question being, how do you outline ethics?
The ethics in AI? Do you there are some, that could be the example given in the question is, if the synthetic tech allows a live translation of someone speaking in Japanese into English, such phenomenon certainly will contribute to the globalization, but at the same time, moment would slowly affect the jobs of translators, language specialists. This impact the ethical ideas on AI was the question.
For sure. So I think this is definitely an interesting conversation around issues of cultural diversity as well, and what does it mean in terms of loss of when we have these kind of exchanges. At one end, it is facilitating exchange. At the other end, it may mean that some jobs are lost, or some languages themselves lose importance because everyone is talking in just a few. So definitely, I think these are ethical concerns. What UNESCO's recommendation does here is it outlines certain values. We won't probably get answers to specific questions, but it outlines values and principles and then gives policy areas. So in terms of values, is human rights and fundamental freedoms, environment, which is significantly also present in this recommendation. Then also we are talking about autonomy of individuals. So the bunch of these values, respect for cultural diversity, which frame and guide our overall reflection on ethics related to AI. And when you talk about social security and someone losing jobs, there has to be a way in which change is managed, in which social systems support people. We cannot just have technology going for a free run without having people being supported. At the end of the day, we don't want to leave anyone behind. So some of the AI policies that we are seeing are focusing a lot on, and maybe my colleague from OECD will probably talk a little bit more about that, would be on retraining and reskilling of people who are already working, whose jobs are becoming obsolete. So that kind of support is needed in all these cases.
Thank you very much, Pratik. I think you have really contributed to enlightening us all about the many issues involved in AI. I will now pass the floor to our next panelist.
I'm sorry. There is a huge question now at chat. If you allow me to read it.
Yes.
There is a question from Sivu Brahmyan M, and it's in the following. In matter related to very basic internet technology, for example, related to the web, the world does not have a design expertise required to design basic. Very basic web forms and the basic design of electronic communication as between the organization and customer and user. Even large organization design their communication that brings the customer user up against the wall. For example, if there is a form with a question, how did you reach there? The form is designed with answer in full option, by train, by air, by boat, by bus. And if a person has actually walked to his destination or reached by bicycle, the form has no place for his probable input. The form can't be submitted. Neither the webmaster, not official executive, is anyway in vicinity with a visible email address or published phone number. The organization stays behind the security privacy wall. The user customer is trapped in limbo. Happens with forms designed by such large companies as DHL and even post office, and happens in cases of interactions with banks in matter related to simple financial transfers to known customers. The difficulties magnify in the case of small organization and in the countries relatively new to internet technology. A fair question would be to ask, do even large organizations and even governments know how to design form or the overall design of electronic communication?
So maybe I take it. Is it like that?
Yes,
yeah.
Certainly,
okay.
Certainly, Pratik.
For sure. So there are two aspects to the question, right? First is definitely an acknowledgement how technology influences. And this is French philosopher Bruno Latour who talks about scripts being embedded in technologies, and how if you this is exactly the same when I talked about the standards and how languages cannot be applied and they have to change. So that's why we need to be conscious and make these processes inclusive. The same, you talk about the form and the options available if someone is walking, what happens there. Same with gender. We are mostly talking about gender binary in a lot of places, which is probably not good for a lot of other people who do not identify within the gender binary. So how to make these processes inclusive? There is a need for greater consciousness, awareness, literacy on all these aspects. Now, the second part of the question being, if they are not able to do these basic things, how can we imagine them to do much advanced things? I think it's everyone. It's an ongoing effort. We have to really, really continue to strive for enhancing capacities in all domains. A lot of work is happening on education in the school level itself now. We are working on coding education, but also now working on the software elements on how human rights can be taught. For instance, just to give you an example, and I cannot speak for all, it's just impossible. We at UNESCO have a lot of programs related to coding education. We do a lot of hackathons. Now, part of this work, we have also started to do something related to human rights and the impact of AI on, for instance, freedom of expression, privacy, and biases. We put this as part of the course so that people who are learning and doing this coding work are at least conscious of what are the implications and then can take decisions. So it's an overall conversation and strengthening of capacities at all levels, I believe. And certainly for us also, we are probably missing a lot of perspective as well to be more inclusive. Yeah.
Thank you, Pratik. May I add because I see that there's been an additional small question here, or rather a precision of the question, which is really how prepared is the world for AI? Should we pause to think before plunging into AI technologies? I think this is a very good question. My personal take on this would be that we'll never get entirely ready for AI. And I don't think we can really afford to wait. But what we can do is to try to deal with AI in a way that makes it inclusive, that doesn't exclude large groups from participating. And that's really what we have to concentrate on. It's not so much whether we are prepared for AI. I don't think we will be. We were not prepared for electricity either. But I think we have to think about how we can mitigate the problems that can follow from AI, and above all from, let's say, total automatization. And with these words, I'll pass on to our next panelist, Mrs. Laura Galinda Romero, who's an AI policy analyst at OECD, working at the Artificial Intelligence Policy Observatory. Laura, are you with us?
Yes, Christian, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much, Christian. And thank you so much for the very kind invitation, and to the organizers for the invitation to join the SEEDIG series. And it's truly a pleasure to join the conference together with colleagues from UNESCO, Council of Europe, with whom we are closely working and actively cooperating in this ongoing conversation about AI policies and AI regulation.
Yes. And I would like to ask you the same questions as I have asked Pratik. And I have also one special one for you at the end. But the first question is, as we discussed, should AI be regulated more than it is today? What do you think? Is it necessary to have a national, international frameworks on it, or does what we have actually suffice?
Thank you so much, Christian, for that question. I would like to echo what Pratik said, that there's a need for a multi-stakeholder approach to AI, and I think that has been reflected in the past 2 years, ever since the adoption of the OECD principles. There are, of course, many adjustments that need to be done to existing law, but also there are many aspects of existing law in many areas of the law that could also be leveraged, and in fact are already being applicable. Human rights frameworks, in areas of liability, in areas of product liability, in areas of competition, in many other areas. But of course, countries are seeing a need to adjust their legal frameworks to address the specific challenges raised by AI systems. And in that effort of looking at how to adjust existing legal frameworks and existing policy frameworks, is what from the OECD, we are learning how countries are implementing their national AI strategies, and also how to make those adjustments that can help policymakers address the different challenges posed by different AI systems. Most of the basis of the work of the OECD is the OECD principles, which are the first intergovernmental soft law legal instrument that was adopted by our then 37 countries in May 2019, and now 44 adherents, including Brazil and Singapore. They went on to form the basis of the G20 AI principles adopted in June 2019. The AI principles is divided in two chunks, let's say. The first 5 of these principles are value-based principles, and they relate to ethical and safety questions of AI. For them to be trustworthy and human-centric, they refer to matters of course, privacy, inclusiveness, promoting well-being, fairness, transparency, explainability, robustness, safety, and of course, accountability for the implementation of AI systems. These lay down the key actions that all AI actors should consider across the AI lifecycle. And the other 5 principles, there are 5 recommendations to policymakers with key actions to implement in order to foster an AI ecosystem that can thrive on the long term and benefit societies and economies, and of course, the planet. And here I would like to echo what Pratik said. Regulation is one of the tools across many other policy responses and interventions that a country has access to, that policymakers have access to. And that is why, in fact, governments are starting to explore the spectrum of possibilities from soft law instruments by setting national ethical guidelines, and also toolkits. And we have seen, for instance, in Singapore, the model framework to help companies to implement trustworthy AI. Also in Japan, we have the AI governance guidelines, and in the United States, in many countries, there are these specific type of guidelines for development and deployment, and we're seeing even more specific ones for explainability and to promote transparency across the AI lifecycle. So we're seeing already those policy interventions. Of course, now the focus has turned to discuss the legal aspects around it. And we are seeing, of course, efforts in exploring how to calibrate precisely the existing legislation and see whether there is room for adopting new rules and for which type of a specific AI context, AI risks, AI situations, and as they arise. So that has seen what you already might have been aware of in Europe, also in other countries where they are exploring the best, sometimes risk-based approach, and sometimes also regulatory experimentation to see also how to benefit from other types of innovation in the absence of an understanding of which impact they might have across society. So in that effort of calibrating, and here I'm using the word that Lord Think Clement Jones uses when he explains risk-based approaches, is the work that one of the works that the OECD is doing with the working group and with the classification for AI systems. This working group aims to come up with a framework to classify AI systems that Gregor mentioned at the beginning, and that precisely that's one project where we're working closely with our international governmental partners. And it aims to be a structure to help policymakers to assess and classify different types of AI systems according to the impact on the policy areas covered by the 10 OECD AI principles. It's very important to understand that it doesn't not just looks at risks, but also benefits. And across it's 4 dimensions. The idea is precisely to help policymakers as they move and navigate this momentum of on the need to regulate, what to regulate, and how. So this is an ongoing conversation. The framework has already been under public consultations. We received several comments from many different stakeholders, and we're now incorporating these comments, and hopefully by next year, we hope to launch this framework.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think that our hosts would like to display the results of the poll so far, the intermediate results of the poll. We'll continue afterwards. Please, over to you, Olga.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, it was also very interesting for us what our participants are thinking, and whether they at all are thinking or worried about the use of the AI. This is why we asked this question, and we see from the answers that it's almost, let's say, the majority thinks that AI brings more opportunities than threats. Then we have the next, it's like 45% of participants support this, and then 33% of participants think that the AI still brings more threats than opportunities, and 22% of participants said that this is why they came here to find the answers, what it is that AI brings into our lives. So probably that would be great to hear from you and from our speakers what they think on this, and whether they agree with how their voice is divided.
Thank you, Olga. I think it is really, I think what the poll here shows is, let's say, the general picture that you will find in discussions about AI. And I personally, I'll tend to believe that there are great promises in AI. But as with any technology, any kind of development that we have, it is very much about the way we use it. That's really makes it either a threat or a helper. And I think it is I think the important thing is not, in my view, it is not to leave everything to the market here, but to really put in place a framework that will allow for the benefits of AI to be fully developed and for the less beneficial aspects to be controlled one way or the other. I have a question also, which has been put in the chat. I would ask you that now, Laura, because it is actually for both of, it is a question that is asked to the OECD, but also to the Council of Europe. And it's from Idil Kula, who asks, how would CAHI and OECD evaluate the emergent fashion of deep biasing practices of AI, which started to create a new exclusive market? In my own view, assuming deep biasing is the sole cure for all of the problems regarding AI is an unhealthy approach. Arguably, there are many private stakeholders who act on the promotion of this deep biasing idea and treat it as a magic wand, among other solutions. No need to mention the lobbying efforts and its impact. So, Laura, I would like to ask you first, how do you see the deep biasing issue that was mentioned here?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Sure.
Yes, we can hear you. Are you there?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, there you are.
That's a very complicated question, and somehow, in terms of the technicalities, it involves out of my scope of expertise. But of course, there's, and this is, I'm talking here from a personal standpoint. The biasing, of course, all efforts should be made so as to ensure that there are no biases in these AI systems, and that could go from increasing more diversity, and that is at the team level, the organizational level, at the oversight level, and also in terms of multi-stakeholder participation, as Pratik was mentioning. This should be a conversation that at all levels of governance, different stakeholders are involved, and different points of views are involved. With regards to the technicalities, or whether, for instance, there could be even AI tools to debias AI, that of course is very welcomed, but of course is the subject to be tested, and continuous monitoring is going to be key to see that debiasing techniques meet their promise. Here, for instance, as part of the catalog of tools, the auditing of AI systems by third parties it's a very promising initiative, in the sense that it can provide a much more trust to society, and of course can make better enforcement work, and also that regulation would help as to ask for these requirements ex ante, ex post, and so on. So I think it's something that should we strive for, and all the different tools in place, incentives in place, and the awareness that it requires multi-stakeholder participation, and the capacity building, as Pratik was mentioning, so that we increase AI literacy to understand better the impact of AI systems. So I hope I answered your question, but as I said, it's a very cross-cutting question with different impacts, and the idea is, in the end, to promote trustworthy AI.
Thank you, Laura. And for my part, in answering the question, because it was also posed to the CAHAI, so the Council of Europe, I actually think that the most important aspect of this is recognizing that there is bias, that the technology is not neutral in that sense, and that it depends on the data set that you put into the AI system, what kind of answers you get when you use it. So essentially, recognizing that there is bias and that we are all biased, I think is the first way forward. There's another question, but I will come back to that because it's related to the question.
Sorry, there's another question in the
Yes,
chat.
I saw that, but may I come back to that after the question I am going to ask now?
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Are there some aspects of AI and its use which are more important to regulate than others, and why, Laura? And then we come to the other question.
Sorry, Christian, could you please repeat that question?
Yes. Are there some aspects of AI and its use which are more important to regulate than others, and why?
Thank you. Yes, as many different examples have shown, and also as part of the risk-based approach that many international organizations and countries have started to explore, the different AI systems raise different AI policy considerations. So it's not the same, of course, Siri playing a song in Spotify in my phone, or a recommendation system suggesting which candidate to dismiss or not in a job offering, or suggesting which children should take this type of exam or be ranked this way for entering to a specific university, and so on. So there are many different risks and impacts, and of course those that affect directly the enjoyment of human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. There should be more specific guidelines in place, and that is precisely, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Christian and Pratik, the objective of enacting an international framework so as to address these risks in a way that we can use AI systems that are trustworthy, and for those that bring certain levels of risk, have a system to mitigate them. Of course, it's important also to consider that not only banning or imposing a moratorium, it's kind of one first solution. It might be temporary. We would need to keep exploring on how, even as new technology emerges, those things could be corrected, and less impact would be generated across society. So a part of the, for instance, another tool, as I mentioned, is regulatory sandboxes. Before they enter into the market, exploring which are those impacts and those challenges and those risks to the existing legal framework and in different areas would be something to address and to explore, and also for policymakers to understand what specific challenges are raised by these new emerging AI breakthroughs.
Thank you, Laura. And now we come to the question that was raised in the chat, and I think we can all of us from international organizations at least give a partial answer to that. It's from Wanda Munas, who asks, "Hi everyone, and thanks for a great discussion. Question: why are military applications excluded from mainstream discussions such as those of UNESCO recommendations and proposed regulation by the EU Commission, among others, when they nothing less than impact the right to life and have enormous implications? Why are these left out to be discussed only in the framework of international humanitarian law? Thank you very much for a fascinating and informative discussion." And I will start to take part of the question first, because it is indeed something that we have also been discussing in the Council of Europe, but it has a lot to do with mandates. Different organizations internationally have different mandates, and the issue of the military applications of AI, generally speaking, do not fall within the civilian international organizations' mandate and purview. It doesn't mean that it's not dealt with, but it's dealt with in other fora. That would be my answer. And I do recognize the importance of military, of also tackling the military applications. They can be quite frightening in some respects, but there are some limitations on what different organizations can deal with. UNESCO, for instance, culture, education, Council of Europe, human rights, rule of law, democracy, and the OECD is economic cooperation. So it somehow rules out some of these aspects. That said, military applications are usually dual or multiple use applications. So they can also have applications that are civilian. And those aspects, I think it's important to tackle, even though the original application use may have been military. Laura, would you like to chime in on this one? Or
I would like to echo what you said, Christian, exactly that. The focus of the OECD is to promote international cooperation for economics and in development. The area that is not covered by the OECD is defense. And for that reason, we don't enter into those discussions are out of the scope of the mandate.
Thank you, Laura. I'm glad that we have the same approach, sadly, though. Pratik, would you like to add something here?
Absolutely, in concurrence with both of you. It's a question of mandate. And as you mentioned, it's education, sciences, culture, communication and information, and defense matters are left out from UNESCO. So we can't go. Having said that, for someone who asked, there is a discussion on this definitely going on broadly in the international community on lethal and autonomous weapon systems. So you can check, I think, the discussions in Geneva around this question amongst governments going on as well.
Exactly. Laura, what are, in your view, the most important elements in AI regulation? And again, if you can choose three, I know it's a little bit of a game, this, but I give you the floor for that.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, as Pratik said, this is a tricky question, but I think one aspect, so three things. The first one is to understand the different developments, understand the different policies, see what other countries have done, what has worked and what has not worked, what are emerging incidents across AI systems to avoid precisely those risks that have already materialized. And in this learning process goes to the DNA of most of the work we do at the OECD, which is to bring the evidence base for policymakers, for researchers, for everyone to have a systematic view of the landscape. And that's why the group that I work for is called the observatory, because it's to observe these emerging phenomena across the world, particularly in our member countries. And through this work, which is available at OECD.ai. There is data and trends on AI, and also live data on news, live data on AI skills and AI research. There's over 700 national AI policy initiatives from over 60 countries. And that evidence base, the aim is that it helps to share and shape AI policy as we continue to move as part of this AI journey. So that is one for aspects, to look at the evidence base. The second aspect, multi-stakeholder participation and continuous dialogue to reflect on all the different issues that emerge, not only in terms of regulation, but also in terms of AI investments in research and development, and also challenges and opportunities and digital infrastructure for AI, measuring computing, computing power for AI, discussing how to raise AI adoption, particularly by small medium enterprises, how to build the human capacity in terms of the skills for the future of work, and also to enable a fair labor market transformation. And of course, to look at how to be the forum to enhance and promote international cooperation on AI, not only in terms of building interoperable frameworks for AI regulation, and here what I mentioned at the beginning, to look at the work of classification of AI systems the OECD is doing, but also in terms of AI research and development at the international level, how to bring more and build more bridges between research teams and so on. So across this holistic approach to AI policy, the idea is to bring more participation, and for that, for instance, the OECD created the OECD Network of Experts of AI, and with over 200 experts from government, the European Union, the Council of Europe, UNESCO, United Nations, and many other civil society and academia groups, and of course the private sector and trade unions. We are reflecting constantly on how to harness the benefits of AI, while also looking at how to mitigate this risk with a different set of tools. And for that, concretely, we have recently launched 2 reports that I would like to invite you all to look at. A report on tools for trustworthy AI that explores all the different types of tools that different AI actors have put in place. And another report on the state of implementation of the OECD principles, with a particular focus on national AI strategies. So it draws insights from over these hundreds of initiatives that have been put in place in the past 2 years. So with that, I conclude the third point, which is to raise AI literacy and to raise the capacity building so that no one is left behind, and we all promote, develop, and use AI in a trustworthy manner.
There's a question now. Thank you very much, Laura. There's a question now from the audience, from Eleonora Bonell, who wants to know, an issue that is close to me is the idea of technology pollution. What is the current state of affairs policy-wise relating to carbon and environmental footprint of new technologies? Is this being considered within existing AI legislative proposals in Europe? Would you like to start, Laura, for instance? As it is slightly touched on the economic field.
Yeah, this is something that we are exploring as part of the working groups. Of course, the OECD principles, in fact, look at how to bring trustworthy AI, and it's precisely said, for society and the planet. So, of course, as part of these, in the EU particularly, there is this agenda for a twin transition that is digital and green. And of course, that infuses most of the digital agenda of the European Union, and of course, including AI, including most likely these new initiatives on building semiconductors and many other, let's say, digital infrastructure initiatives. So this would be impacted, of course, by green agendas. And we just remain hopeful to look at these interactions and see, of course, that the development of AI contributes to the planet. There are many initiatives also and projects at the national level where countries have set as part of their research projects and are funding with many grants missions so that AI serves society, and particularly how to mitigate climate change. So we're seeing in many countries, for instance, how they are funding access to data sets, to have access to satellite data, so to predict and help to work with different climate change initiatives. So that's a very promising area. Yesterday, we saw the launch of the UK strategy. There they have also focused on how to mitigate climate change. So I think I would remain positive in seeing many changes going that way, not only in terms of policy, not only in terms of regulation, but also particularly public-private partnerships in bringing more AI solutions to mitigate the climate change.
Thank you for shedding some light on this. I see in the chat that also Pratik has chimed in, and please go there and have a look. There's also a link posted for UNESCO's work with regard to environment. My personal contribution to this very briefly would be that AI technologies impact every aspect of our lives, and I also think that they will have an impact. We have to discuss them in terms of environmental policies as well. We cannot just look at it as a technology or a matter or a legal matter. It is something that really touches on all aspects of human activities. Now I would like to ask you the question, Laura, how would you preferably approach AI regulation and why? Would you go through legally binding or non-binding or regulation, or would you have public regulation, or is self-regulation the way ahead? Please, Laura.
Thank you, Christian. Of course, I'm a biased person because I'm a lawyer. But that doesn't mean that laws are the only solution. It has to start at the levels of awareness, at levels of really changing the culture and many other incentives so that our behavior, it changes and also adapts to these new scenarios in a way that we reap the benefits of AI systems. So not only regulation, as I said from the beginning, and echo what Pratik said, there are many other tools. I see that, for instance, more working also research and development, more fundamental research to understand how to make systems much more explainable, much more transparent. That's also a way through which using policy instruments such as funding, providing direct investment for research could also bring a lot of light on these issues. With regards to building the capacity to understand AI systems, understand their impacts in society, but also to develop them in a way that they respect ethical principles and legal regulations. That's something that goes to the heart of the OECD principles that talks about how to reskill and upskill the population. And that goes across all levels of education. And in terms of not only formal education, children and the youth, but also bringing these type of literacy through vocational courses and lifelong learning opportunities. There's a constant need that all of us would need to retrain and train to ensure a fair labor market transformation and of course understand these risks and these opportunities.
Thank you, Laura. I have one last question from you. And this is about, I think, something that we are very, very often discussing when it comes to the regulation of AI. Can we meaningfully regulate AI without unnecessarily impeding innovation and economic growth?
So how to strike the balance?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's an art. But I think one way, a third way that countries are finding kind of in the middle of this spectrum of possibilities from soft law to hard law is regulatory sandboxes. It's not, of course, the solution. It's not the panacea for all these conundrums, but it's something worth exploring. So that how can we create these spaces within legal systems and national frameworks to understand better and see whether it can work in this context. Of course, not something that works in one country will necessarily work in another country, but see how policymakers can learn, how entrepreneurs can be encouraged to also test innovation and test the limits of scientific breakthroughs in a safe environment. So I think that kind of abstraction is something interesting to explore. The EU AI Act provides for that as part of the coordinated plan. And it would be very interesting to see pilot projects in these and emerging regulatory sandboxes and how the international, let's say, system is informed by these developments. So it's something to look at.
Thank you very much, Laura, for these insights. I will now turn to our last distinguished panelist, Mrs. Cesara Panate. And Cesara, you are head of digital policy at Europol. And unlike the previous speakers and myself, you are not working in an international organization, but you're working on how to make international organizations do more of what they should do. So I would like to welcome to the panel, and I would like to ask you the same questions as I have asked the other panelists. I think we may get some interesting new aspects. Cesara, welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity. First of all, I wanted to thank a lot to the SEEDIG for organizing this event. I think it's a real honor from my side to be in the same panel with distinguished speakers from international organizations such as Council of Europe, OECD, and UNESCO. And thank you so much, Christian, for the introduction. Should I answer the first question?
I will, exactly. We'll move on to that for sure. We have and I think this is the same question that I asked everyone, but it is, I think, a very basic one. Do you think that AI is sufficiently regulated today, or should it be more regulated than it is already? Does what we have suffice? Do we need something new?
Exactly. So in order to answer to this question, I would like to have some preliminary remarks on the AI app impact on our daily lives, and then the way further to go on regulating it. So we already see that our society is being transformed to the interference of artificial intelligence. For example, it's used in criminal justice system, in healthcare, in assessing individuals' creditworthiness, or in the employment sector, or in the online content display and moderation. So AI is a promising technology in improving societal well-being, enhancing the common good, and fostering innovation. But at the same time, it also has malicious uses, or it can be used in such ways that can endanger human rights and democracy. So technology is neutral, but the way in which it is designed, deployed, and applied in practice can have potential dangers to human rights and democracy. So for this, we need to accelerate the adoption of trusted, transparent, and inclusive AI systems at the global level. For this, we need to bridge the gap between different initiatives and to strengthen the international cooperation towards setting up the basis for global cooperation on artificial intelligence. So regarding the question, do we need regulation on artificial intelligence? I believe that yes, we do. We don't have at this point a framework or a global convention on regulating AI, but there are multiple layers on which we can tackle AI regulation. There is no single option of having one set of rules for AI at a global level or even at national level. We need complementary approaches based on multi-stakeholder approach, as also the previous speakers mentioned as well. And with regard to the loopholes that there are in the current legal framework or the proposals that we are discussing now on artificial intelligence, I think there is already this issue of the implementation gap, first of all. Then second of all, the consensus is becoming harder and harder to achieve. And there are certain issues that remain uncertain with regard to AI regulation, and they can be, it can lead to ambiguity. So many legal instruments are now trying to be developed, in order to understand which is the feasible framework to have for artificial intelligence. But the fact that we have different approaches, it's leading to this implementation gap, and it's harder to implement in practice. I would say that we need to look more to find consensus and to focus more on interoperability and finding complementary aspects that we can implement in designing such policies. There are certain regulatory gaps that we need to tackle in our endeavors in finding this regulatory balance in artificial intelligence. And we see the involvement of different actors from international intergovernmental organizations, from state actors, private companies, or the involvement of these all together in the multi-stakeholder approach. We do have risks for either over-regulating or not regulating. With the not regulating AI, I see that there is no problem in that. We also saw that in the poll responses that a regulation for AI is needed. So this is necessary, and we are certain that there are more opportunities than threats in regulating AI. However, we need to find this balance between the regulatory approaches that we will promote further on, because at the same time, over-regulation could hinder innovation from decelerating AI competitiveness, delaying technological growth, missing out innovative solutions, or losing potential innovators, investors, top talents. And the impact for private companies and startups, small and medium enterprises will also have different repercussions with regard to the effects of AI regulation in practice. So to find a global governance of AI, we need to have a common vision, and then to find different approaches at the level, for example, national level, regional one, and even wider at international level. That would be my answer for the first question. Thank you, Christian.
Thank you, Chisara. That was really very comprehensive. My next question is, are there some aspects of AI and its use which you consider would be more important to regulate than others? Why
yes.
would you do so?
So my answer to this question is actually in line with what the previous speakers, Pratik and Laura, also mentioned. So I would stress out an important need to pay attention to fundamental rights protection. For example, strong safeguards should be implemented for right to life, or safety and security, fundamental rights that can be potentially influenced and impacted by AI regulation. And we see the perspective of the European Union in having this high risk based approach in deciding what areas are potentially more influenced than others, and they need further regulation. So fundamental rights would be my opinion on this issue as well.
Yeah. How do you see the impact on democracy?
On regulating AI?
From AI, yeah.
I think we have, for example, we have new challenges for democracy now regarding to the right to free elections and the interference of AI in this area, or in the right to access to information online, which can manipulate users' decisions, which can influence them, have some political perspectives. I think we need to find new solutions to tackle the challenges that are posed to democracy, because from traditional challenges that we used to have, now we have additional ones which are posed by new technologies, and not only AI, but this is a particular case in which this kind of technology can impact various aspects of democracy and its protection worldwide. So I think we need to have strong safeguards for this as well.
Good point. Good point. What are, in your view, the most important elements? And again, I'm playing this little game of giving me 3 elements. Which are the most important elements in AI regulation, in your view?
So my 3 elements would be, first of all, I would say flexibility in order to foster innovation, because as we see, we now have this multi-stakeholder discussions on regulating AI. We need to accommodate as many visions as we can to develop multilateral platforms and partnerships with other countries to develop and deploy AI applications in order to foster innovation and competition. But also at the same time, we need to provide flexible and adaptable standards that could offer sufficient incentives for businesses to continue their operations, to offer space for testing and assessing the legal or social impact of different AI systems. In order to offer this kind of flexibility, we need to reach a point in which we need to have rules that can be adjusted in time, addressing their role in the AI framework regulation. And the second one would be that it needs to be future-proof, ensuring a holistic, democratic framework that could survive during the following months and years, because the AI regulation, especially if we talk about hard law, is not something that we will change during every 6 months. So we need to ensure that the targets, that the objectives that we are now targeting through the regulation to the legally binding standards that we are going to develop further, they need to have this to remain available and accurate in the future as well. And the third one would be large-scale applicability beyond regional initiatives. I think we should aim to find a wider consensus on the basic principles and aspects that we want to include in the AI regulation, although they are not going to go into a lot of details, which will be the role of national initiatives on AI regulation and so on. But I think to find at least the global principles that we can all agree on would be a future step to look towards.
I think these are very wise words indeed, Cesara, and I can assure you that it's also something we are considering very carefully in the Council of Europe when it comes to looking at the possibility of having a legal framework. And may I add also that it is, as was also said by various previous speakers, it's the combination of instruments which is important here. There should be some binding and some non-binding, and I think there's space for everything of it. Which are the main stakeholders in AI regulation in your view?
So, for example, I have distinct approaches to the stakeholders based on categories that they're representing. So I would go from the top-down approach, for example, intergovernmental organizations. And here we see that more actors are joining the initiative Global Policy AI, including 3 of them present here, but also other stakeholders such as World Economic Forum, and actors with different mandates, for example, safeguarding human rights and democracy, or AI ethics, or different mandates to promote AI in their fields, but also coming together to the same objectives on having this regulatory framework for artificial intelligence. That would be the first layer. The second one would be regarding state actors. So we see different perspectives on regulating AI from state actors such as US, China, the European Union as a whole, but also, for example, UK just published a few days ago their long-term plan on the national strategy they want on artificial intelligence. So we need to find a balance in deciding what are the regulatory approaches from state levels as well, and how to promote that further on. Beyond that, national states will have a great role in implementing their local national strategies and what are the standards that are relevant to them based on local circumstances and their initiatives. And also another aspect would be regarding the impact of private companies which are imposing and adopting self-regulation, so standards that they're voluntarily committing to in order to promote artificial intelligence. And of course, these self-regulation standards are not binding, but I think they're much welcome, especially when we want to have them on board and respect human rights, conduct due diligence, human rights impact assessments, and other kinds of useful tools to promote and safeguard the human rights and well-being of the society through their role as a stakeholder in in the discussions. I think altogether they should be taken into account. So that would be my answer to your question, Christian.
Thank you very much, Cesar. It leads me to another question, because you have mentioned a couple of times now the importance of large-scale legislation or regulation, if you like. So what we are talking about, what you're hinting at, I assume, is a kind of global framework that would be applicable to not just a region or more regions, but really create the level playing field. Do you think it's a possibility?
I would say probably it's wishful thinking. I'm not sure if that's feasible in practice, but I want to think that it might be possible to agree, at least on the base, on the level playing field that we want to achieve through AI regulation. I know it's very hard to reach consensus, especially at this global level when we have divergent opinions on how AI should be focused in the regulatory framework. But then I think we should aim to that. And if we don't manage to have the global consensus on AI, at least we can have regional initiatives, as we do now with the Council of Europe, with the European Union AI Act proposals, the AI ethics proposal from UNESCO, and then with the different regional initiatives. I think it's a very important step. But of course, the approach that we should aim for in deciding the framework for AI regulation should be mixed. So a legally binding framework should be complemented by soft law approaches and other kind of initiatives that will tackle on different levels other areas of AI involvement, for example, sectorial legislation in data protection, non-discrimination legislation, consumers protection, competition law, and so on. So I think we should aim to find this right balance, although it's a huge challenge and the task we will be working for probably some years more on.
I like your optimism.
Yes.
And I think it's called for, I'm afraid. How would you preferably approach AI regulation? You have already mentioned it a little bit. So you have the legally binding, the non-binding parts, and then you have the public regulation and the self-regulation. Do you think it should be a combination of all of them, or is there one of them that you prefer?
No, I would say they should go hand in hand, and we should find the approach that is allowing their complementary approaches to be at the same time applicable.
I think these are wise words again. My final question to you, and now we are getting close to 12, but I think you still have a little time to think about the answer here. AI is impacting us all. Do we have the necessary public debate about AI in Europe? And do we have it around the world, in your view? Are we sufficiently dressed and prepared for this, for dealing with AI? This also was, in a way, one of the questions asked previously by some of our audience. What do you think?
Yes, so now I have the privilege of representing the civil society on answering this question. So I would say that I see a lot of involvement from different actors representing civil society organizations, think tanks, and they are eager to join public consultations, to respond, to bring input and their opinions to the table, and they're joining expert groups meetings and multi-stakeholder partnerships in which they can bring their involvement and initiative to contribute to the AI regulation. But more than that, I would say that probably AI regulation is quite a technical subject that could not be easily understood by general population as such. So I think many efforts could be made in this area of disseminating the content that we want to transmit in a way that is understandable by general public audiences. And I think there are many steps that are promoted in this area through explanatory videos and visualizations and content that is disseminated in a user-friendly format, so that the general public can have a better understanding of what we are talking here about AI regulation and this kind of approaches, soft law, hard law, legally binding, which for lawyers are, of course, very easy to understand. But then I think our efforts should concentrate in bringing this subject closer to the general public, and then receiving a lot of input from them. And of course, continuing the efforts that we started, continuing integrating their feedback into the public consultations and the evaluations and the impact assessments that we're going to be considering in designing AI regulation. That would be my answer. And thank you so much again for the opportunity and for the very fruitful discussions, and to the previous panelists. It was a pleasure to be in the same discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Cesara. If I may add on a personal note towards the end here to what you have just said, I think it's very, very good to see that AI is finally stepping out of the labs and into the political agendas. So it's actually something our politicians are starting to look into, and it's something that they have to take serious. I think it's also part of, putting it on the agenda and making it possible for us to have an informed debate publicly about AI and its role, so that it's not just something that's done by the engineers in the lab. Thank you to all of the distinguished panelists that I had the pleasure of speaking to. I think it's been extremely enlightening and enriching experience for all of us. Thank you also to the audience for some really great questions. Thank you again to SEEDIG for inviting us at the Council of Europe to co-moderate this important event. And over to you, Olga.
Thank you very much, Christian, and all the speakers. As I said, as I started this event, it is indeed our huge pleasure to have all of you with us today. We know how busy you are, but that was really great to hear from you what you are doing on the daily basis, and where we are moving with the AI regulation. And I hope by now we have a better idea of how this regulation might look like. And if possible, I would ask our tech team to display the results also of the second question of our Zoom poll, which was about how AI should be regulated. And we see that 77% of participants align with more to the international regulation, 9% support national regulation, and there are some 30% who actually came here to find an answer. And I also want to mention one very important comment which was made in the chat, that actually that has to be a combination of the regulation at different levels, and that should depend on the specific issue which we are approaching. So once again, huge gratitude to all of you and to our participants for staying with us for these 2 hours. We wish you a nice end of the day, and we also encourage you to check our updates on social media and also on SEEDIG website, and to join us for the next events. We promise to make them interesting as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.